Welcome, everybody, to the Silver Screen Action Figure Podcast. This is your host, Andre Joseph of AJ Epics Productions, and I'm back with a very timely episode because today I'm going to be discussing the classic 1980s action hero franchise Rambo, starring Sylvester Stallone. Originally, my plan was to do a Stallone-centric episode that would focus on not only Rambo, but also the action figures from Rocky, Over the Top, Demolition Man. But since we have the recent release of the fifth film, Rambo Last Blood, I figured it was timely to finally take on this quote-unquote champion of liberty. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a second. And later in this episode, I'll be giving my thoughts on the recent release of Last Blood, because I do have some thoughts on it, having seen it just now. So let's go back to the very beginning, just to give some context on this franchise. So Rambo began as a novel in 1972 by David Morrell, who was writing based on the stories of many of the Vietnam soldiers coming back from the war who were suffering from PTSD, who were distraught by the deaths, the horror, the unfounded reasons for getting into the war in the first place. And Morrell wanted to channel all that into a character that was not only suffering from PTSD, but was essentially bringing the war back to his homeland. And it was a very controversial novel in its time due to the climate of the Vietnam War. Rambo, if you may have heard the backstories behind the movie, he kills over hundreds of people, including innocents, including the National Guard, and I believe he even kills the sheriff that's after him. So he ultimately ends in a tragic fate, and it was a very controversial, best-selling story that Hollywood spent a decade trying to produce as a feature film. Every major actor was considered for it, most notably Steve McQueen, who wanted to do that big motorcycle chase that you may remember from First Blood. But he was kind of like taking a hiatus from acting around the time that they were about to make the movie originally. So many studios passed on it due to the fact that they didn't know how to handle the violence and they didn't know how to make that movie connect when, even in the late 70s, there was still people didn't want to talk about the war. They didn't want to really get into the stories. And there was resentment towards the soldiers in that time when everybody wanted to forget about what happened. By the early 80s, the duo of Mario Casar and Ennio Vagna of Carolco, they were like just a small independent distributor who were able to buy the book rights. They signed Ted Kotcheff, who directed the original Fun and Dick and Jane, to direct the picture because he had been eyeing it for many years. And they made the bold choice once they got the financing to sign Sylvester Stallone. And everybody knew Stallone from Rocky, but he hadn't really had a solid hit outside the franchise. And the studios were almost sort of writing him off despite the success of the first three Rocky films. And there's movies that I like that he did at that time, most notably Nighthawks, which is definitely one of my favorite movies ever, and I think one of his better films outside of both franchises. And, he made the choice when he signed on to not have Rambo kill anyone. Yes, maim him with his knife, set up traps, do whatever he can to evade the National Guard and the sheriff and his deputies, but never kill anybody in the movie. And supposedly, when they finished the film, it was very long. It was drawn out. It was almost a 3-hour cut, from what I understand. And so it tested poorly, especially with the original ending with Rambo dying. So they had to not only change the ending for Rambo to survive and ultimately be captured by Colonel Troutman and the police, but he also had the movie cut down to be more focused on the action. And what you got from First Blood in 1982 was one of the first true action pictures. I mean, this is a year after Raiders of the Lost Ark, so you had a non-stop 90-minute, tightly paced action picture with some incredible stunts, with some incredible action, and Sylvester Stallone in a different type of role that was not Rocky. Yes, you sympathize with him. He is the underdog in the situation, but he brings to life something that a lot of veterans at that time were able to relate to, And it just struck a chord at a point when America was finally coming around to forgiving the veterans and realizing they were not treated well when they came home. So, First Blood was a blockbuster in its day, and no surprise, they want to make sequels to this. So, just quickly recapping the sequels that came after, saving the fifth film for later, you had 1985's Rambo First Blood Part 2. This time, Rambo is offered an opportunity to get out of prison by going back to Vietnam as part of a covert operation to take photographs of Vietnamese camps. And he's not supposed to engage the enemy, apparently. But he goes down there, he makes a contact with this Vietnamese woman, and they do find American POWs. And when he makes an attempt to save them, the very people, with the exception of Colonel Troutman, who put him on the mission, decide to abandon him in Vietnam because they don't want to suffer that embarrassment. So there's some insubordination going on, and Rambo essentially has to fight his way out of Nam against the Vietnamese, against the Russian military led by Steven Berkoff's character, and he goes to town. He's not only killing people, he's blowing the shit out of it in Vietnam. And this was a movie that was very critically panned in its day. It was totally removed from First Blood. Rather than dealing with the drama of his PTSD and this idea of he's just Frankenstein created by the military, now with Stallone all jacked up, he worked with the Arnold Schwarzenegger's trainer. Now he turned into a superhero, and he really had become like a cartoon character as a result. So it's kind of like a dumb premise. James Cameron, by the way, wrote the original script before Stallone rewrote it. So it definitely has like Stallone's politics mixed with James Cameron's approach to action sequences. And what you got from that movie was a very entertaining, explosive action picture that, again, innovated the genre. And it was the second biggest hit of the year behind Back to the Future. And that's when this franchise really started to take shape into other forms of media. 1988, you had Rambo 3, which probably had an even more absurd premise than the second film. This time, Rambo is in Thailand. He's getting the stick fights for money. Like, he's trying to get away from it all. He's done with America. He just wants to live in seclusion. Colonel Troutman comes back because he needs him for a special operation in Afghanistan against the Russians. Rambo turns him down. Troutman goes on his own anyway. He gets captured. Rambo gets word. He has to swing into action. And this is the one that's probably the most controversial today, because this was at the time when you had the Afghanistan-Russia conflict going on. And so Rambo ties in with, we're just going to say, he ties in with the Taliban in that film, at the time when the Taliban was seen as the good guys against Russia. And it really, again, goes really over the top with the action. It was one of the most expensive movies produced at that time. Stallone, I think, was on steroids because he looked even more jacked up than he did in the second film. Women were like really prone to these movies because he runs around shirtless and, the ripped muscles with the scars. So, like, he was trying to follow in the same formula and really try to dial up the action to 11, which he did here. At that point, when the film came out, there were video games. The franchise was already kind of like in parody zone. It didn't do quite well in the United States, but around the world it was a massive success. And I think at that point, it probably didn't break even enough to generate more films immediately after, and Stallone wanted to do other things. He knew that the character had devolved into parody. So for a while, probably like over a decade, he did not do another Rambo movie until 2008, when he came out with the simply titled Rambo, or in overseas, John Rambo. So with the fourth movie, now he was trying to go back to the roots of the original. Stallone as Rambo is much more in a darker place. He's in Thailand. He's like a snake wrangler now. There's no Troutman because sadly Richard Crenna had passed away a few years earlier. So in his place, you have these religious missionaries from America who want to go to Burma and help the Burmese people. Of course, they hire him to be the one to take him over there, and he's kind of resistant, even though they're paying him a lot. He knows how dangerous that place is. And so he ends up taking them. There's an incident that happens, but he manages to get them over there anyway and goes back. Long story short, the missionaries are kidnapped by the Burmese military. They hire a mercenary group to tie in with Rambo to go and get them back. I was very reluctant with this movie. I thought at this point Stallone was already in his 60s. He's not going to run around shirtless. He's not in the shape he used to be in. He was coming off of the success of Rocky Balboa, so he's coming out of that huge slump that he was having. But then I saw that trailer. Holy shit. This was bloody. This was violent. This was just an intense picture that didn't have the sleekness of the previous two entries. This was, guerrilla filmmaking at its finest. They're in the jungle. It's brutal. Stallone, now in the director's chair, is really giving you this hard-hitting, tightly wound 90-minute action picture. Again, the reception was mixed on it, but for the most part, it was seen as a welcome return to the character. Let's talk about the toys. In between Rambo First Blood Part 2 and Rambo 3, kids were just now going crazy over him. Again, they were treating Rambo as a superhero in 1985. You had Ronald Reagan quoting, "Oh, next time I know what to do, when we're in another conflict in a foreign country, I'm going to call Rambo." I mean, it got absurd. And you even had this point where water guns were starting to become a big trend, and companies like LJN with Entertech were tying in with Rambo and creating realistic looking water guns that kids were able to buy and play with in their backyard. But no surprise, those guns would also be used to go and knock off some stores, and shit would go down. And there had to be some legal regulations put in our government to stop the manufacturing of those water guns by the late 80s. And that's how we had Super Soaker. So, now we all of a sudden had to kind of like get into PC culture into the 90s. But let's talk about the 80s. So, at this point, they decided G.I. Joe was really popular with Hasbro. You had the cartoon, the toys were selling really well. The militaristic aspect of the figures in their 3/4 inch frame. Kids were all into that craze. And the cartoon itself, Joe's versus Cobra, everybody shooting each other with laser guns, nobody's really killing each other. So what happens when the Rambo producers decide to cut a deal with Ruby Sparrows Productions, the company behind Alvin and the Chipmunks, to make an animated series in the style of G.I. Joe, but now using the Rambo license. And that's how you got Rambo, the Force of Freedom. And this came out in 1986, aired for 65 episodes. And basically, they turned Rambo into the leader of a G.I. Joe style group alongside Colonel Troutman. And they're running around a bunch of fictional countries and territories to take on the Cobra knockoff known as S.A.V.A.G.E, aka Special Administrators of Vengeance, Anarchy, and Global Extortion. And so Rambo and his group, they're basically fighting these guys around the world. There's like environmental issues that are in some of these episodes. They try to like dive into politics, but not too heavily to distract kids and confusing them. And this was one of the rare occasions where you actually had cartoon characters using real guns in the cartoon. Nobody dies, but it was clearly like an expensive show to make because they used the Jerry Goldsmith music. They had, realistic gun sound effects. I mean, this really got parents in an uproar at this time. That's why it only lasted one season on the air. It was just taking a character that was troubled from Vietnam, dealing with PTSD, turning this character into a cartoon character was just like everybody like threw their shit. So it wasn't surprised that there was a huge crackdown on this. I'm sure Mr. Rogers must have blew his lid. And yeah, that the cartoon didn't last long. But there was an action figure line that came out of it. Once again, I'm going to just say this again because I said it for Police Academy and I said it for Ghostbusters. I am aware that, yes, the toy line is based on the cartoon, based on the film. I don't care. We're going to talk about the toys anyway. And there are other toys that are directly based on the films, so we're going to get into those too. So the toy line got handled in 1986 by Coleco. And if you know Coleco, they had their own video game company that actually made a Rocky game. And they also were best known for the Cabbage Patch Kids. So if anybody wants to ask why Rambo never joined the G.I. Joes, it was because Coleco had bought the license to make Rambo toys. Unlike the G.I. Joes, these were 6.5 inches. So they were almost to the size of a Barbie doll, which was so unique, but also kind of difficult to play with. And, just on a personal side note, my neighbor, who I will credit, my former neighbor, who I credit for getting me into Star Wars, getting me into wrestling, he was a big collector of these Rambo figures. And that's how later on in life, when I started going to toy shows and going to flea markets, I kind of got into that kick for a little bit and started trying to buy as many of these Rambo figures as I could get, because I started not really getting into Rambo until like the mid 90s after he moved out. So let's begin. The only two figures in this line that are anything from the movies are Rambo and Colonel Troutman. So in the case of Rambo, the 6-inch figure is the exact likeness of Sylvester Stallone in the second film. He's got the camo pants, he's shirtless, they got the scars, he's got the pendant. He also has the same kind of facial features as Stallone. His articulation isn't really exactly the way the G.I. Joes are. Maybe in the legs, but not so much with the arms. At least with this, there's no rubber bands attached to his legs that easily break apart. That was always the thing that pissed me off about G.I. Joes. I'll talk about that in a later episode. And his weapons, everything that you remember from that movie. He's got that big machine gun that you see in every poster. He has the rocket launcher. He has even like those tea knives that he would stab the guys with. And of course, the famous Bowie knife is in his accessories. And he's got the bullet belt around his chest, which you can remove. And that's the thing, too. All of his accessories are removable, including his gun belt. So that was sort of one of the rare things about this line that I have to say, was that everything was kind of mobilized, and I think the rocket could actually fire as well. But I think due to the fact that they weren't doing the spring-loaded weapon stuff because of what happened with the Boba Fett figure for Star Wars, that a lot of that stuff was kind of mechanically done, or actually you have to do it manually to shoot the rockets or any other accessories that they came with. I could be wrong. There was also Firepower Rambo, which I personally owned for the longest time. I remember buying this in a Toys R Us. So the Firepower Rambo, that's the one where he's got the sweatshirt, he's got jeans. I don't want to say it's exactly like the way he looks in First Blood, but it's almost close to that if you have him in a civilian attire. He's got like a rocket launcher gun. He comes with grenades. He has another Bowie knife. He has a not rocket launcher. He has a flamethrower. Doesn't fire anything, and he also comes with a backpack. So now another thing about this line is a lot of these figures came with sound effects backpacks, so they actually could make noise. They could do friction powered shit. Not much to say there. I mean, that was one thing to try to make it unique from G.I. Joe's. Oh, they could also do their own sound effects. Then you had Colonel Troutman, which I will say is dead on the likeness of Richard Crenna. And just like Rambo, he has his own knife, he has a machine gun, he has a 45, he has a radio, he has a backpack as well that also is kind of like friction powered, if you want to make noise, making it look like he's shooting from his gun. And actually, the bullet belt goes through the backpack, so it can make that noise. It almost looks like the bullets are going on and off. Those are like the only ones based on the films that also were in the cartoon. Everybody else from here on, it was strictly made for the animated series and did not appear in any of the films. Among the characters, so the Force of Freedom, again, just to reiterate, they were basically the G.I. Joes of this Rambo cartoon. And among those characters, there was Turbo Hayes. He was the African American mechanical engineer and race car driver. Interestingly enough, he was voiced by James Avery, best known as Uncle Phil from The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. His character, he comes with also a machine gun. He comes with like a German pistol. And he has what looks like some kind of backpack with like double twin rocket launchers. Then you had the character of Kat. Kat was an Asian American military woman, master of disguise, gymnast, martial artist, and I can absolutely confirm this character was based on the Bao character from Rambo First Blood Part 2. She dies in the movie, but for whatever reason they decided let's make an animated version of her, not call her that character, but it's sort of like a homage to her. She comes with a grappling hook backpack, as well as two Uzis, a machete, and some kind of a sidearm. So again, they were trying to, I guess, have somebody that looked like they were from the film. Lastly, we had in the first series White Dragon. I'm going to say right now there was White Dragon, there was Black Dragon. These were definitely knockoffs of Snake Eyes and Storm Shadow from G.I. Joe. They were supposed to be like these twin brothers. One sided with Rambo's group. The Black Dragon sided with the Savage group. So they were just a bunch of ninjas. Okay, so then aside from the Black Dragon, you had your Savage villains. The main villain in the cartoon series who would have his toy line is General Warhawk. He had the famous reflective sunglasses, so you never saw behind his eyes. He was a former German military captain who was selling state secrets. He was deported, and then he formed this evil organization. His action figure had a retractable sword that actually could fire the blade. He had an AK-47, he had a .45 pistol, and he had a grenade launcher rifle. I want to say just from his attire and his look that he may have been based on Steven Berkoff's character from the second film, since we were into the whole idea of having European bad guys back in the 80s, and in this case, Russians, Germans, you name it, they were going to be the bad guys in this series. Then there was a second-hand man, Sergeant S.A.V.A.G.E. Sergeant S.A.V.A.G.E, he was like this tank top dude. He kind of looked like he was a Russian. He shot a bazooka that could also fire a rocket launcher. By the way, all the rockets and stuff, they, unlike the later G.I. Joe toy lines where they actually had the rockets spring loaded, the rockets are actually tied to a string, so that way they didn't fire that far. That way they're not poking somebody's eye out. He had an AK-47, he had a machete, he had a pistol, and he had binoculars. The fact that they say he had the same strength as Rambo, he was supposed to be based on the second-hand villain in Rambo First Blood Part 2. They're very identical looking. And that part actually was almost played by Dolph Lundgren, just to mention. He lost that part, and that's how he got Ivan Drago, because Stallone remembered him when he auditioned for that film. Then there was another infamous villain known as the Gripper. Gripper was probably best known for the eye patch. He had the red beret, and he was also a one-armed man. He actually had, on his other arm, he had a claw. It was like a metallic claw. And it reminds me of the bad guy that was in the movie If Looks Could Kill with Richard Grieco, because they kind of have like the thing where they take the arm hand off and put like a metallic hand on it. So that was him. He had, Jesus, 5 Uzis. He had one of those recoiling pistols. He had a machete. He had one of those recoiling backpacks. This guy was badass, just looking at him now. And it had to be really crazy, again, parents buying toys that had realistic guns. This was the 80s, folks. There was no shame in this day. If you could make Police Academy toys after that R-rated first movie, you probably wouldn't have been surprised that they would be doing Rambo figures back then. There was another villain known as Mad Dog. He was the Mohawk bad guy. He looks like one of those bad guys from the A-Team action figures that Galoob made. He had also a recoiling backpack. He had a shotgun. He had a knife. Typical looking, I would say if you know G.I. Joe, he looks like a dreadnought. That's kind of what they were going for. And also, many of the villains had tattoos on them, as well as the good guys. I would say that the bad guys had like the Savage tattoos either on their clothes, like on their arms, or on their chest physically. And most of the Rambo characters had the Force of Freedom emblem with like a big eagle. It's either on their side or usually on their weapons. Or if they have civilian clothes on, then it would be on their civilian clothes. And lastly, in the first series, there was Nomad. Nomad is your typical Middle Eastern 80s bad guy. I'm not going to say too much about him. I don't want to offend anybody. The second series, that may have been the ones that weren't released as much because the toy line was not a big seller. I'll get into that later. So we still had some other Force of Freedom characters. We had some more villains. We had T.D. Jackson, who looks like some guy in a jacket, a football shirt. He has like a knife. He has a sidearm. There was Chief. Chief is a total knockoff of Spirit from G.I. Joe. He was a Native American good guy who's got this big ass machine gun. He's got a sniper rifle and he has a Colt 45 revolver. So yeah, he was Spirit from G.I. Joe. That's all I gotta say about him. We got a second Warhawk figure. This time he has khaki pants and the same shirt, but the collar is unbuttoned. He has a hawk. He, I think, has like some kind of spring-loaded action because he comes with a whip, so he could actually whip Rambo if he wants to. And he also has like a boa constrictor whip. He has a knife. He has a German Ruger pistol. There was another bad guy, Snakebite, who looks like a jungle trapper. He has one of those grappling things that you would like hang alligator with. I guess he's supposed to be like an alligator wrangler, and he comes with snakes apparently. He had some interesting weapons here. There was Dr. Hyde. So really the villains were starting to get cartoonish at this point. Dr. Hyde, he had an AK-47. He was a cybernetic mad scientist whose head is in a dome-shaped helmet. So he's sort of like a cyborg robot in this group. Yeah, they were running with their imagination with this cartoon. What can I tell you? And then looking at his face up close, okay, yeah, I could see how this would scare children. Because his face is like half melted with the skeleton, his brain exposed. Oh my god, what the hell were they thinking back then? And then there was another villain named X-Ray who looks like Jason Voorhees. He's got a robotic missile arm, and he also has an Uzi. So, I mean, like, we were getting into sci-fi territory here. There was a play set for this. It was the S.A.V.A.G.E Strike Headquarters. This is 40 pieces of action here. This had, like, a little bamboo-produced tower. It had a machine gun with a stockpile, with M60 machine gun, a bunch of AK-47 rifles. It had a guard tower. This was basically the only Rambo playset in the whole line. And there were a whole variety of additional weapons and vehicles that were produced for the figures, some of which were actually released in Argentina. And they all fit the figures. You had a Defender assault vehicle, which was like a six-wheeling Jeep, which I guess was part of Rambo's group. There was a Skywolf assault jet. There was the Skyfire assault copter, which I guess belonged to the bad guys. You had the Savage Strike Cycle. Some of these vehicles could shoot missiles and do all kinds of cool stuff. Others pretty much were just stationary. You had to use your imagination. Some of the additional weapons were like stuff that you could actually have the characters sit into. Anti-aircraft gun. There's the recoilless anti-tank gun. 20 millimeter automatic cannon. There's a 50 caliber machine gun with a tripod. Most of these were on tripods, by the way. You had additional weapons assault packs. You had a twin mounted 7.62 millimeter machine gun with a bunker. I'd say Coleco really did their job in trying to understand how guns work, and whoever was behind this must have been from the military because they were taking everything that the military was using back in those days. It probably still to this day. And in a nutshell, that was the Rambo Force of Freedom toys. again, these didn't last very long. They only lasted for those two lines from 1986 and 1987. I believe parents were definitely pissed off. They didn't want their kids playing with it. I think for kids, the toys were hard to play with because they weren't made in the same kind of quantities as G.I. Joe. G.I. Joe had more flexibility, more mobility with the vehicles, the play sets, and I think we're a little bit more imaginative. Whereas Rambo, if you didn't watch the cartoon, you just felt like they were deviating from the films. And I think Stallone, even if he made some money on the merchandising, probably felt that it was taking the character into the wrong direction, and that's one of the reasons why he went with more of a serious tone in the later movies to try to avoid the parody, even though that was very hard to do past the third film. Now, there were still Rambo toys being made. Surprisingly enough, there were no toys made when the third film was released in '88. But over time, the character still remained relevant in pop culture. It was still Stallone's second most popular role. So, no surprise, there would be other figures that would pop up every now and then over the years. In 1995, the company Toy Island, which was handling the Robocop license, produced a G.I. Joe size Rambo toy based on the cartoon, and they called it Rambo Champion of Liberty. If you look at the packaging, it's the Rambo from the animated series. So it's really just Rambo in the same exact articulation as a G.I. Joe, in the same attire as the second movie. Now he has two gun belts around his chest. In 2001, the short-lived company N2 Toys, which is the company behind the Matrix action figures, and they also did figures for the Road Warrior, and many of the employees for this short-lived company used to work for Kenner. They produced a Rambo action figure. They also produced a Steven Seagal Above the Law action figure. And with the Rambo one, this was based on part two, and it's the same exact likeness, the same weapons, but he's more in a stationary movement. He doesn't move around much. He basically looks like he does in the poster, and has more of Sylvester Stallone's likeness than the Coleco toys. In 2013, NECA produced not one but two Rambo action figures that were based on First Blood. So this is the first time we got some First Blood toys. They had made Rambo in the poncho as well as with just the tank top and the jeans. And yeah, he's dead on the likeness of Stallone, the same weapons he used in that movie. And, not much I could say other than the fact that these figures were definitely better produced with more care, more artistic looks than the Coleco toys. And NECA would also continue to produce other Rambo figures during this time, including a Rambo First Blood Part 2 action figure, which they actually went and not only did it have the same weapons from the second movie and the same exact look and likeness of Stallone in that film, but they even did a convention package in 2015 that was paying homage to the Coleco toys. So it had the same packaging as the Coleco figures. And of course, you may have seen that there's also a repainted Rambo figure based on his video game likeness from the infamous Nintendo game from the 80s produced by Acclaim, which was a terrible game, by the way. It really should have been like Contra, and instead they were trying to make it like Zelda 2, The Adventures of Link. But it was a cool action figure because they painted him in red, just like how he looked in the video game. The red pants, and I think they changed up his skin color to make him look more tan. It's a pretty cool looking figure. I believe there were also, there's a lot of Hot Toys dolls of Rambo that are out there from all of the films. Some company, and I can't find the info for this, tried to make some action figures from the second and third films based on the other characters, not just Rambo, but there were supposedly a Trauman figure. I think the figure of the bad guy in the third movie, Colonel Zazin, I think his name was. I think there was even a Will Teasel figure, Brian Dennehy's role from First Blood. So if anybody has information on that, please send that my way, because I'm actually cannot find pictures of it. I thought NECA produced them, but I don't know if they were ever released. So, unless they were done in prototype form, I don't know if they exist or not, but I know I saw it listed somewhere. And there were a couple of figures based on the fourth movie, which were really more statues than anything else. And I've only seen a couple of these. They were kind of cool, but again, the Rambo height was those first three films, especially between the second and third movies. So finally, I'm just going to recap, just to close out, talk about Rambo Last Blood. All I gotta say is, I think if you're a fan, it's better than the second and third films and feels like a companion piece to the fourth movie. You know, Rambo's living on an Arizona ranch that was owned by his family, and he's sort of like getting a little bit more open to life because this Mexican woman and her granddaughter, they've sort of formed their own little family. He's still dealing with the PTSD, but he's taking medication and he's built this whole tunnel under his property, which is sort of like his way of dealing with therapy. And then something happens, long story short, where the adopted daughter goes to Mexico looking for her father, ends up getting captured by these Mexican cartels who end up selling her as part of a sex trade. Rambo finds out. What do you think is going to happen? You know, it becomes a violent blood fest. My only issue with this movie, besides the fact that Stallone's just getting too old for the part, was the fact that it started feeling more like a Death Wish film. I think when you don't have Rambo in the jungle environment, and unless it's going to be like First Blood where he's on the run, having Rambo in more of a domesticated setup and making him into Charles Bronson, it just doesn't feel right. You know, that was the one thing I gotta say, was there was just too many times where I think he talks a little too much, and he's just a little bit too much like a generic action hero at this point. He's not the Rambo that I remember. That being said, I will give it points on the fact that Stallone didn't phone it in. It's still violent. It's still bloody. It's going to swing in a number of ways politically. If you want to say that maybe Stallone is getting into some anti-Mexican sentiment, or if he's trying to say something else. I'm not going to get into politics here, but all I could tell you is that if you just enjoy action movies and you want to check your brain at the door and you're tired of the sensitivity of the times, this is the movie for you. Otherwise, I would give it 2.5 stars. I would probably go deeper than that. I'm not going to spoil what happens at the end or anything like that, but I would say it's more of a rental. I wouldn't pay my money to see it in the theaters unless you just feel like you want to just have a good time and have that little escape. So that's all I got to say about Rambo. In terms of figures we didn't get that were not produced at the time, there's not many. I mean, look, if you go back to those original movies, if they weren't based on the animated series, I would say I'd love to have had a Brian Dennehy Sheriff Will Teasel toy. I would have liked to have had, you know, even Marty Cove playing like the one other bad guy in the second movie if they had made a figure of him. I could say Cobell, but technically the cat figure from the Coleco toys is probably as close as we would get to her, so I'm not even really going to say I wish we would have had that. There's not much because we had a Rambo, we had a Colonel Troutman. They were really the main guys, and I couldn't go and say, "Oh my God, I needed to have a Julie Benz from Rambo 4 action figure." So you know, there wasn't much. I think they overdid it to the point where they had to get crazy with these cartoonish villains, and it really, like, if you look back at those figures, if you even look back at the commercials for the toys, the Rambo action figures encapsulate the 1980s in terms of the fact that there was no political correctness in those days. It was very conservative. Rambo was treated like he was Superman, and they marketed the hell out of this. You know, all those action figures, all those video games, it seemed like it was glorifying a character that really should never have been glorified to begin with. But that being said, it's still something I remember as a kid. I'm more of a G.I. Joe guy, to be quite honest. But this kind of stands out in its own way as really a time capsule of what it was like to grow up in the 1980s, to be buying an action figure based on a PSD-driven Vietnam veteran. On that dark note, that is the Silver Screen Action Figure Podcast. As always, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter at SilverscreenAF1. And if you want to email me about thoughts, comments, or suggestions for future episodes, email me at silverscreenafpodcast@gmail.com. All right, guys, I got to win myself some food, and I'll see you at the movies.